Hello and welcome to another Adventures in Machine Embroidery episode with me, John Bloodworth, Gentleman Crafter. This week I'm taking a design that I made and digitizing it into the embroidery design that you saw. First up, I'm going to make a couple of changes to my workspace by turning off the Apply Closest Join and also by setting the centering to manual. I'm then importing the design, which is an EPS image, and that will be available as a free download from my website if you would like to give this a go yourself. I'm then zooming in and locking that image in place. Next up, I'm going to choose the Digitizing tool, set the stitch type and the colour, and then I'll start designing. Now initially I was going to do these as separate bars, but given their size and the fact that there would be jumps in between, I decided to try and do them as one entire length, and that's just for the little bars in between. The reason I'm doing this is because I want to do some of the design as Redwork and some as just a single run stitch type. So I'm using the Digitize Open Shape, which requires me to click the mouse wherever I want a node. Left click will give you a straight corner point, and right click, as seen in yellow, will give you a curved corner point. So hopefully from those little flashing indicators you can see which I used as I plotted this out. Now when I get to the end and I've finished plotting the points, I press enter to set that in place. And there you can see everything's worked out fine. Hurrah! Now let's take a look at the next job. I'm going to use the same tool for this, same stitch type, but I'm going to choose a different colour. And the reason for this really was to set it apart while I digitized. Of course I could change it later, but also to, if I was to keep these colours, to force the machine to do a colour stop. Now I could carry on stitching, it doesn't really matter. Basically I'm just using these tools to the best advantage that I can while I'm digitizing. I can then tidy up the design, resequence it and recolor it later on. That's not a problem. I'm doing the same for the inner frame. And you can see over on the right, I haven't always had the expanded view of the sequence tab open, but when you do, you can see the stitch type, the stitch style, the color and the design within that sequence tab. You'll see a few different icons later when I've done the Redwork as well. So I'm going to select the ones that I've done already, lock them and hide them, or hide them and lock them in that order. Next up, I'm going to go in for some of the detail that's going to be made into Redwork later. Doesn't matter which order that I sequence these in. When I apply the Redwork style, as you saw in the last couple of videos, it will reorganize, It'll branch them off and apply the appropriate stitching in the right order, which I think is a godsend. Okay, so there's the first part. Now the other week I used the freehand open shape to use spirals, and I did mention that you can of course use either of the Digitize open shapes or freehand open shape tools. So this week I thought I'd use the other tool to show you really that there's not much difference, but B, with the Digitize I have much more control over where the nodes end up. and how many are positioned on that line. So I'm actually using the start and stop points of those bars that I've already digitized as anchor points for the curve, and that way hopefully they will all land pretty much on top of each other. Now, because of the size of the design and the size of the stitching, I'm just basically having to make a few minor adjustments to some of the nodes at the end to keep the form of the spiral. As you can see, the stitching actually adjusts itself as I'm making changes to where those nodes are. So it's automatically recalculating how many stitches and where they need to fall. So very much the same process for this spiral as well. And of course, if you are using this software, you can use different stitch types, but because I'm going to apply the Redwork feature to it later on, I'm just working with the single run stitch. And here again, just making some fine tuning after I've done the main digitizing, just to try and keep as much of the detail in the design as possible. Okay, so just unlocking and unhiding the previous stitches that I made, just to see how the design's coming along. And I've noticed that I've actually missed a line here, so I'm going to go back in and redigitize that, or not redigitize it, digitize it. Using the same tool, the same color, and then when I get to the end, pressing enter to set that in place. Okay, so we've got the main detail in place. Next up, I'm just going to digitize the lower frame or border. I'm not really sure what to call it actually. And now, whatever we called the inner one, that same thing for the outer one. I really should think of the words before I start talking, I guess. That's how it works, isn't it? Okay, let's take a look at this. When I was digitizing, I had my suspicions that this was going to be way too small to actually do anything effective with. And as you can see, as I was using the freehand open shape, there really wasn't much room for any stitches whatsoever. So I tried the other tool just to see if it would make a difference. So that's the digitized open shape instead of freehand open shape. But as you can see, despite being quite true to the outline, obviously there just wasn't enough room for the stitches. So I decided to put in just a basic straight stitch as a bit of detail. And then it's a good time to save it, as I've got everything in what I want. And then I decided actually that was just going to be a bit of a faff, especially with jump stitches. So I took out that piece of the design. Now for the Redwork, I selected all of the stitching that I'd done in red and clicked on the Redwork feature, and then pressed enter so that the system would automatically create the Redwork. And as you can see in the sequence tab, there's now a new icon, everything's bunched together, and it's basically calculated everything it needed to. I'm changing the other stitches to red as well. And then just resequencing a little. And then it's time to use the layout tools. So I used the circle layout, and I made sure to set the repetitions and mirror alternate. And then found the center point where it looked about right, and just left click, merged those inner borders so that I had two inner frames that would just stitch as one length. Everything else came out individually because it wasn't necessarily overlapping, but that's fine, that's not a problem. For the lettering, I typed it in the lettering tool, centered the text, and then from the embroidery type, started having a scroll through all the different options. Now it did take me a while because I was just trying them all out. In the end I settled on run freehand. Deleted the image because I don't need that anymore. Grouped all of the outer detail, and then used the alignment tools to align the design and the text. I then turned off the manual centering and went for automatic so that it would get in the center of the canvas, and saved it. I ran it through the stitch player just to sort of get an idea of what sequence it would use, as sometimes it's hard to imagine using the sequence tab on the right, and I've already noticed that things are sort of jumping ahead a little bit. So I went back in and started moving things around, and I went out of true view into just your basic view, just to sort of see where the jumps were and how they would change with the sequencing. So I decided that all of that Redwork detail needs to be together and all of the inner detail needs to be together, but the inner detail needs to be first because it's going to stitch underneath the Redwork. As you can see, I'm just going around a bit. I have sped this video up just a tiny bit, so whenever I'm clicking somewhere, it's not always necessarily to do something, it's actually just to sort of see where it is on screen. So once I'd done that, I also wanted to just double check the in and out points to minimize all of the massive jumps. So I did start moving around start and stop points. I won't show you all of those, but I just gave you an idea there. Now, I basically wanted to be able to trim jump stitches as I worked. So rather than export this all as one color, I changed every single element to a different color. That way it would force my machine to basically stop in between each section, so I had a chance to get in there and trim. Basically I would just ignore the colouring that it suggested and just keep the bobbin and thread the same when I'm actually stitching it out. And I did that next, and here it is. Okay, thanks for joining me for another adventure in machine embroidery. Don't forget to visit the blog gentlemancrafter.com to download this file along with the image to give it a go yourself.